Riitta Katila is W.M. Keck Chaired Professor in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering at Stanford University and co-director of the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. Her research is in the intersection of technology strategy and organizational learning, using machine learning, statistical analysis, and mixed methods. She is an expert on innovation, competition, and entrepreneurship in large firms, and her current research centers on responsible and inclusive innovation initiatives. Dr. Katila is also co-directing the Peak Initiative on purposeful entrepreneurship. Good morning, Dr. Katila. Welcome to Trusted Peer Entrepreneurship.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. You have done extensive research on the lean startup method. Is lean startup now the lingua franca of innovation?
That's a great question. So absolutely correct that lean startup is widely used. It's a common language for entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial researchers, academics, governments, big corporations. So it is a huge success story. And if you don't know the method, the idea of lean startup is to give innovators a method for shaping a business idea. So lean startup helps iterate your idea and make it better. So back to your question, is it now the lingua franca? It is absolutely one of the key methods you should know. So part of its appeal is that it's intuitive and it's very inclusive. Its idea is simply that everyone can innovate, everyone can create a new business and a new idea and take it to market.
In your videos and research papers, you use the term innovation more often than the term entrepreneurship. Does entrepreneurship have exclusionary associations that you want to avoid?
As academics, we separate inventions from innovation. So invention is just an idea. Innovations, in contrast, have market validation. They are ideas that are commercialized. They are ideas looking for buyers or already have buyers. In my view, entrepreneurship is very related, but perhaps it's broader. So you're building a business.
Okay, great, got it. Should a course on lean be required as part of a liberal arts education?
Again, great question. So entrepreneurship and teamwork are all great skills to have. So advocating a course on scientific methods and scientific thinking also makes sense to me. And I say this because at its core, the lean method is a hypothesis testing method. It is a blend of thinking. You write down hypotheses and then doing. You test hypotheses through interviews. So this blend that underlies lean startup makes understanding of how the scientific method, that's pretty similar, how the scientific method works, particularly important. So I would advocate a course on scientific method, scientific thinking, and maybe even lean.
Not all students will go on to work at Silicon Valley technology startups. Would you advise university entrepreneurship centers and programs to include the study of corporate intrapreneurship in their curricula?
I'm excited that this next generation of engineers, in particular, be encouraged to be entrepreneurs, innovators, and in general, leaders who improve the quality of life and create jobs of the future. Some of them will work for startups, for sure, but a large majority will work in big established companies. And how to change a big established corporation is tricky. So what makes the lean startup teams that we have studied, they are National Science Foundation's I-Corps teams, especially interesting from the diversity standpoint is that one of the goals of a National Science Foundation's I-Core program that we study is to give the lean startup training to a more diverse pool of applicants. Lean method in this sense become a stepping stone for underrepresented minorities, for more women to commercialize technologies and learn about entrepreneurship. We all know venture capital in general and the startup scene, especially in Silicon Valley, is very homogeneous. So what Lean Startup does, it gives more diverse applicants a chance to go through this program, to hone their ideas before prime time, and hopefully feel comfortable applying for more funding and for more support for their business ideas. This is a seed round, in a way, encouraging more people, everyone, to become entrepreneurs, whether in companies big or small.
The core of Lean Startup is getting out of the building and talking to customers. Of course, it's more than just talking to customers. How do you teach students to conduct customer interviews that yield desired outcomes in terms of clean feedback?
If you have a science or engineering background, Lean Startup's experimental approach will look very familiar to you. Step one is you formulate a hypothesis. Step two is you test the hypothesis by getting data. You measure and then learn. Step three is the learning. You confirm or disconfirm your business model using the data. So what makes Lean Startup different is that step two, the testing. It's done by asking your external stakeholders, especially customers. So it's not testing inside the lab, but rather making customers the central element. What students using Lean often get wrong is that they ignore the hypothesis writing phase, or they don't tie hypotheses to interviews. The critical first step of the method is to write down hypotheses. And then as a second step, start talking to them through potential stakeholders, start testing those hypotheses. So this temporal sequence is critical. Stating a hypothesis first forces the team to activate deeper thinking about cause-effect relationships. Without a hypothesis, you are unlikely to engage in these thought processes about cause and effect. Without a hypothesis, it's also very easy for the team, for the students, for any outsiders for that matter, to look at the data and the results and say, hey, we already knew that. Or then you get lost in the ambiguity of too much data. So hypotheses are critical. They help you state your causal relationships clearly. Simply put, each of your interviews is a data point. So through the Lean method, you will get some real-world data about your hypotheses, whether they were confirmed or disconfirmed with a stakeholder you interviewed. Students also sometimes struggle with what a hypothesis actually is. It's simply a cause-effect relationship. Like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So that's a simple hypothesis you can test. It has an X, that's an explanatory variable and an outcome variable. So X is apples, Y is not visiting a doctor's office. And then you argue that X is influencing Y. So that's a testable relationship. So make sure, if you're using Lean, that your hypothesis actually lay out a causal relationship. And finally, I would say, we also discovered a surprising third benefit to actually writing a hypothesis. Interviews based on hypotheses can even inspire teams about new business ideas that they have not previously considered, something that you didn't even think about to hypothesize. So that's a surprise.
So from my own experience, speaking with customers is very difficult, and coming up with the right kind of questions that don't lead the customer into a desired response. How do you teach that? How do you teach the actual, how do you structure the questionnaire? There's the hypothesis, of course, but then, okay, I'm going to ask 10 questions of 100 customers in order to test my hypothesis. the structuring of the questions is very important. This is what I've found. How do you teach that? How do you teach them, or is there someone on the team who is from, say, psychology, who knows how to do research with humans?
Great question. So you don't typically ask about the causal relationship. Your customers won't be able to give you clear reasoning for that. But what they know really well is the process they go through every day. So think about yourself as a lawyer in a courtroom. Ask about what happens first when you go to work in the morning and interact with the product. What happens? What happens then? What's next? So think about your interview as a process interview, asking about the lives of the customers, what they're going through every day, rather than asking about why they're using something. So why questions typically don't work well. And what happens first, what happens next work better. But start with those hypotheses. Think about the entire business model canvas and think about what is it that you want to find out. And then what are the underlying processes that customers actually could describe to you?
Great, thank you. In Research Insight, new data on lean startup, and also your research paper, The Lean Startup Method, Early Stage Teams and Hypothesis-Based Probing of Business Ideas, you state that lean startups' share ubiquity is why it is an important method to study, and also one of the most widely used methods for creativity and innovation. If you work in a big established corporation and you want to shake things up there, chances are that you have, or you already have, used the lean startup method. How ubiquitous is lean in large corporations in the United States and globally?
I would say it's a method.
Okay.
In uncertain times, as a leader, you need direction, and a lean method gives you one method. It's a path to try. Mm-hmm. But if you academically look at the results that the method delivers, they are certainly intriguing. So in our research, which is published at the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal, we find that the startup team's tendency to conduct more stakeholder interviews is positively tied with how fast the startup grows later. So more precisely, we find that those startup teams that conduct more, that means an above average number of interviews, are likely to employ twice as many employees in 6 or 12 months after the lean startup training as similar teams that interview less. So the method seems to be working. So customer interviews seem to relate to more business growth. So it speaks to the credit of the method. It seems to be working. And again, we have evidence that so many companies, big and small, are using it, both government, both for-profit, both nonprofits.
If you were giving a seminar on innovation to mid-market CEOs, and these are, let's say companies that have revenues of 100 million to 3 billion, would you advise them to implement a lean startup-based process to develop a pipeline for new product development? In other words, what would you advise these CEOs as the first steps in implementing a lean startup innovation program?
I would say it's worth for them to try it out. My research has focused specifically on explain the key details of the method. Why are we crafting hypotheses? Why are we talking to customers and other stakeholders? The limitation of our study is that we focused on early stage teams. So based on our work, I wouldn't be able to say exactly whether the results generalize to mid-market. Mm-hmm. So more research is needed to identify the many possible boundary conditions on which the key relationships, key mechanisms of the method might hinge. So for example, team composition might differ, feedback might be different. Team formation process, program length, those details might be different in a typical corporation. So those are precisely the elements that were relatively standardized for us, which was great as an academic for our study, but they're likely to differ in other implementations of the method. But the bigger point is, of course, that we've seen in practice worldwide that entrepreneurship methods like Lean are not only for young firms, they are not only for entrepreneurial firms. Lean startup today is used even more widely by big corporations, by governments, by nonprofits, even established companies such as Dropbox, Slack, General Electric. They have embraced Lean as a way to rapidly test their ideas, refine ideas for products, or even entire businesses. I've seen middle schoolers use the Lean method in science competitions. So simple, intuitive steps of the method, great visuals in business model canvas, definitely add to the appeal. So it is great that we are democratizing entrepreneurship, and we're giving opportunity for building a business to more diverse populations. So there's a stepping stone for many of us to commercialize technology. So if you want more diversity in your innovation efforts, Lean gives you one method to try.
Stanford University School of Engineering has offered the ENGR 245 Lean Startup course since 2010. It is arguably the most influential entrepreneurship course, having been adopted by the National Science Foundation and now offered at 100 universities as the NSF I-Core program. Is your study of Lean Startup at the NSF I-Core program a valid proxy for successful innovation programs for large corporations?
So let me go back a bit. So the history of how the US National Science Foundation adopted the Lean Startup method is very interesting. So back in the day, in 2011, Steve Blank began offering a new class at Stanford Technology Ventures program where I'm sitting, in which he combined customer discovery with business model canvas. So what happened, Steve wrote about this class in his blog, and one of the program directors at the National Science Foundation, Errol Arkilik, reached out to Blank. The two had never met. Errol called Steve out of the blue with something like, Steve, you don't know me. I work for the government. I've been reading your blog. What we want to do is we want to copy your Stanford E145 to 145 curriculum with some minor tweaks. Instead of students, we want to apply it to researchers and scientists who have developed technologies and supported by National Science Foundation grants. But what they don't know to do is how to take these ideas to market. So that's where we want to use your method. And by the way, the teams will be from all over the country. And instead of 8 teams like your class at Stanford, we want to teach 27 teams at a time. And we want to launch this thing in 3 months. How does that sound? So NSF I-Core has been a success for National Science Foundation. It has scaled to other government programs like NIH, DOE. To me, it shows that the method is quite flexible and quite scalable to many different settings.
Could a version of Stanford, ENGR, the 245 Lean Startup course, or the NSF I-Core program, could that be adapted and incorporated into the front end of R&D processes of large organizations to enable what Steve Blank calls an innovation pipeline?
So the key of Lean Startup method promotes evidence-based, disciplined, data-driven entrepreneurship. So if the company is lacking those skills in the front-end innovation processes, evidence, data, direction, the answer is probably a resounding yes. Try it out. But I would say it does not stop there. So it's not only about the data and the method and discipline. What makes the Lean Startup Method and also the I-Core program and its success interesting is the potential that it teaches the steps of entrepreneurship to anyone and everyone. In fact, one of the goals at the government agencies is to increase diversity of folks that try entrepreneurship, such as get more inclusion, more diversity in grant applicants to other programs such as SBIR. So the belief is that this type of training is a stepping stone for inclusion, involving more women, more minorities in the steps to commercialize technologies. And we know that diversity and innovation, they go hand in hand. So a method like Lean that enables a more diverse set of innovators in large organizations to engage with entrepreneurship and innovation, that's got to be good news.
How persistent is the knowledge of Lean Startup training for future innovations by entrepreneurs? That is there a causal relationship for those entrepreneurs at large corporations who had previously learned the Lean Startup method in their evaluation of a prior concept? In other words, is this a way to create a culture of innovation across a corporation as you have more and more and more employees, internal operators who are familiar with Lean?
So we, as a research team, did not precisely test the longitudinal persistent effect. It's of course very important. However, when we presented our work, some audience members have suggested that teaching Lean Startup method as part of MBA programs would be very important, might make the method more accepted in the eyes of business students and make it more likely that down the line, these students will use these evidence-based methods. So early experiences matter. You're absolutely right. They can ingrain you. They will see your behaviors down the line many, many years later. So I would agree with you, and I think more research is needed there.
According to a PricewaterhouseCoopers report just released in January, the report is Living in a World of Unicorns. Between 2005 and 2010, okay, this is pre-Lean, there were only 14 unicorns defined as privately owned VC-backed companies valued at $1 billion or more. In 2021, there were 743 unicorns. The innovations of many of these unicorns will be fully realized in 3 to 5 years. Is the growth in university entrepreneurship centers and programs over the past 10 years driving this unicorn phenomenon?
Interesting question. Depends on how you think about unicorns, positive or negative. But it would be interesting if we found some kind of a link. Mm-hmm. It is true that these big unicorns have some of them have their origins actually at universities. I'm thinking Googles of the world. Mm-hmm. And some were certainly funded by NSF's SBIR program, for example, at some point. But I think what you're really asking is, if we have been able to change the mindsets of our students about entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurship and innovation are within everyone's reach. And in Lean, we do have a method that lays out this step-by-step process of how to take an idea to the marketplace. So entrepreneurship is not a secret club anymore. So it is possible that your hypothesis is true. And in Lean, we also have a method that's not completely reactive as just doing is, nor is it completely proactive as just business planning is. So it's somewhere in between. It allows flexibility when times are uncertain, as they've certainly been in the last 10 years or so. which certainly could be part of driving the unicorn phenomenon. So again, I'm thinking this is an interesting research hypothesis that we as academics should take on and test.
Yeah, I'd love to see the results of that research. Your research is on, lean startup in large corporations. How large is large enough to have an innovation pipeline driven by the startup method? I mean, define large for, in terms of large corporations. Is it in terms of revenue? Is it in terms of a number of employees? What is large?
So many of these startups that we're studying don't have revenue. We're just looking at growth. We're looking at numbers of employees. So I've been advocating the lean method for your personal development journey. So even a company with one employee yourself could be using the lean method. So I don't think there's necessarily any boundaries to the use of it. It could work for you individually as you're just starting out with a very small team, or when you're a big corporation.
For large companies that may hesitate to dive into the deep end for implementing lean startup, do you recommend a professional development workshop for senior managers on lean startup as a way of socializing the concept before a tactical implementation of lean startup projects? And that is, should a corporation teach lean to its senior management before implementing a lean program?
That's probably a great idea. So one upside of lean is that it is very intuitive. So simple steps of the method, great visuals like the business model canvas, they definitely make an easy user interface. So it's easy to grasp the idea, even if you get a short introduction. In our research, we also find that MBAs and lean startups aren't necessarily a natural fit. But MBAs business school graduates can find great success with this approach. So if you have business school alumni in your senior team, you need to prepare for some discomfort at first, and perhaps a workshop in that case could be a useful idea.
You identify that MBAs are hesitant to embrace lean startup because they tend to take a learning by thinking approach stemming from the case study method, which is at the core of an MBA education. Have you found a similar hesitancy for those with an engineering background?
So I'm an engineer by training. I need to start with that. Turns out engineers and technologists are kind of bad with generating business ideas and getting them to market. So their hypotheses are often not supported. But what I have to say is they are surprisingly open to trying the method. So as an engineer, I know I love hypothesizing about the world. I love writing hypotheses. I love testing them, getting the data. I'm a data nerd. So engineers often embrace the lean method. And this is partly perhaps why the NSF's I-Core method worked so well. Teams at the National Science Foundation at NSF, they're scientists and engineers for the most part. So when you have engineers talking to customers and other stakeholders in the ecosystem, they're testing their hypotheses, they will learn a great deal. They often need to go back and change their beliefs and their hypotheses. But at the same time, they are willing to do that. And at the end, they are able to get a great benefit from using the method.
For those entrepreneurs and innovators at large corporations who are participating in a lean startup program, how important is it for them to have access to a network of internal tacit knowledge experts across all functions of the organization? If I am on a team, an internal team, going through a a lean startup process for the concept that whose hypothesis I wish to test, is it important for me to have access to experts within the company, within other functions like sales, government compliance, legal, supply chain, that sort of thing, as I go through the program and testing my hypothesis?
Good question. Not something that we directly tested, of course, because we had startup teams, not teams in a bigger corporation. The core of the method is to formulate those hypotheses. So perhaps involving different stakeholders inside your corporation early on as you craft the beliefs is important. And then leave the building and test them out, and then come back and present the data. So I would say yes, involving cross-functional teams in brainstorming about what are our beliefs, what should the hypotheses be, what do we think about how this new market or this new opportunity, how will it work, probably makes sense, but again, not something that we were able to directly test.
Both startups and new ventures inside corporations face market risks. However, a venture inside a corporation deals with internal risks that startups do not face. And this is what I'm referring to for my previous question about having a network of internal stakeholders, experts, so that you can mitigate some of the frictions and potential saboteurs as you are testing your hypothesis and then ultimately presenting your findings to the corporation.
Absolutely agreed. So not invented here is a big issue in large corporations. When we go out to the field as researchers, when I do interviews to understand the setting, to interpret my more quantitative findings, we always hear about the issue of buy-in and how important it is to sell your ideas in the organization. What I would say is the beauty of a method like Lean Startup is that it is evidence-based. So you can fight skepticism about new ideas with data. So as a method, it's not perfect. No method is perfect, but it does give a voice to a more evidence, more data-based approach in a big corporation. So instead of armchair theorizing, perhaps some internal politics, you actually leave the building and test the ideas with external stakeholders. So there's less politics and more data, more customer-driven decision-making involved about the path that the corporation should be taking. And in my experience, some innovation projects in large corporations blow up because they do have all the resources, they have all the money in the world, but it is invested in wrong ideas for too long. There is no experimentation. There is no denial of failure. There is no acknowledgement that we need to move on. So the idea that Lean Startup could mitigate these risks is a real possibility.
Excellent, thank you. In your paper on Seeing What Others Miss, a competition network lens on product innovation, you stated that the most innovative firms tended to be the ones that were paying attention to the right competitors. You also said, overall, to find novelty, firms should look to the frontiers of the competition network and not the well-worn middle. What do you mean by looking to the frontiers of a company's competition network?
So what I mean is going to sound very intuitive to any entrepreneur. So look at where no one else is looking. Look at what is not changing. So that's where the real opportunities are. So two things about competition are interesting. We found in throughout the research. First, competition is perceptual. It's not objective. So who you perceive to be your rivals, your competitors, matters for innovation. So watching rivals in an industry that your peers are not watching can be a source of innovation. You get different kinds of ideas. You are in a part of a different network. Second, what we learned about competition is perceptions about which competitors matter are persistent. They tend to be pretty stable over time in an industry. So everybody's sort of getting used to thinking about competition in a similar way. Again, that's an opportunity. So if others think that competition in a particular industry is sticky, it doesn't really change over time, perceptions don't really change, that's an opportunity for being unique and entrepreneurial. So seeing what others are missing is important for innovation, important for entrepreneurship.
Being an expert CEO predisposes you to select safe ideas and predisposes you to be impatient versus making decisions based on data and not past experiences. How can a CEO convince their board of directors that they should implement an innovation strategy with a lean startup approach at its core?
I would hope that the board is built to be diverse from the get-go. So homogeneous teams in general, we find in our research, can become overly optimistic about their initial ideas and less willing to probe them. Like perhaps because a group of people with similar backgrounds may be prone to groupthink, or what we call groupthink. So these teams may be less likely to try out new methods like lean. In contrast, a lack of consensus, more diverse teams, they're typically less confident about their initial beliefs, and that makes them especially willing to embrace the experimental nature of method like lean startup is. So as a result, I would advocate for diverse boards. They are probably more likely to embrace new ideas like lean.
In your paper, How Diversity Drives Innovation, you state, expertise blocks innovation. You need 40% experts on your team. And if your innovation teams are made up mostly of people with similar backgrounds, you should broaden them. I am seeing more university entrepreneurship centers seeking to be more inclusive by encouraging cross-disciplinary participation from all majors across a campus, right? So entrepreneurship and innovation, we know, can be taught. Can embracing diversity also be taught? And how could you do it?
I would go back to the idea of what lean method tries to do. It lays out the steps of shaping a business idea, taking an idea to the market. It's a very teachable process. Mm-hmm. So if we can teach that process and make it approachable, make it within reach of very other majors besides perhaps the business majors, I think that's a path of how we can teach diversity or embrace the diversity on campus and bring everyone methods to take their ideas to market. Mm-hmm.
At Stanford, you're currently teaching MS&E 175, which is innovation, creativity, and change, covering problem solving in organizations. How could a large organization benefit from such a course? And who would be the ideal internal participants of MS 175 if it were taught internally?
That's an interesting question. So what This particular course does what we try to teach our undergraduates about innovation, creativity, and change is at 3 levels. We teach them individual level creativity. How can I be creative as a member of an organization, as a member of a team? We teach them team level skills. How can you lead innovative teams? How do you put together a team? And finally, we teach them organizational level skills. How do you sell your idea in a big corporation? How do you design the organization to maximize innovation? So these kinds of skills are useful to anyone in an organization, whether you're very junior, just starting out as a product manager, or whether you are part of an executive team. So anyone needing skills about change and innovation, which is pretty much everybody in a big corporation, should be an ideal participant.
You also teach MS&E 371, Innovation and Strategic Change, which is a doctoral research seminar. So in addition to lean startup, do tools and methodologies like customer development, agile engineering, jobs to be done, design thinking, voice of the customer, and business model canvas tools, do they enter into your teaching discussions at the doctoral research level?
So what's interesting about these methods is that they were studied by practitioners. And as academics, we've been a little bit slow to catch up. So this is a doctoral research seminar, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So we talk about organizational learning. We talk about what we know about learning in organizations in general. As part of that, we talk about planning versus experimentation approaches. But we don't necessarily bring up the tools and methods. So as I said, as academics, we are trying to keep up with the practitioners who came up with these wonderful concepts. Mm-hmm. And I think the ideas will enter the teaching discussions more and more in the future as we get more evidence of how these tools and methods work.
So, what would you advise university entrepreneurship center directors on programs and curricula that you consider to be most valuable and instructive for young entrepreneurs?
Many skills. What you may not have thought about yet is how to bring responsible and purposeful entrepreneurship to your programs. So how do you teach responsibility, purpose, ethics to your young entrepreneurs? Because they are the ones who are going out there to change the world. And we need to equip them not only with skills that help them scale fast, but also make sure they don't break the things.
Dr. Katila, thank you so very much. This has been most informative.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.